But the biggest story in baseball right now has to be the New York Mets. The New York Mets, as we record our podcast today, have lost 11 games in a row, the longest losing streak in Major League Baseball right now. And the Mets just don't look good. They don't look good right now. Longest losing streak since 2004. Swept by the Chicago Cubs over the weekend. And the last game of that series, they had a lead going into the ninth inning. They blow that lead, and the Cubs come back and win it in extra innings. And it's everything that can go wrong will go wrong for the New York Mets right now. When you look at what they've been doing, how they've been playing, it's one thing where all teams find themselves in a rut throughout the course of a 162-game season. But nothing looks good for the New York Mets. Defensively, they don't look like a good team. Offensively, they really don't have anything going. Their starting pitching hasn't been great. Their bullpen hasn't been great. And even the decision-making, from Carlos Mendoza, their manager, who is getting a lot of the heat right now, hasn't been good either. When you look at the New York Mets coming into this season, they made a lot of moves. President of Baseball Operations, David Stearns, saw what that team did last year, the end of last year, the way that team season ended, and said, we can't keep things the same. And so they went out and they made a trade swapping Marcus Semien for Brandon Nimmo. That trade, as of right now, hasn't looked the greatest. Marcus Semien hitting about 260 on the season right now. But Brandon Nimmo, for the Texas Rangers, has an OPS above 900. Now, I know that trade was a little bit less about production and more about the contract. Brandon Nimmo had 5 years left on his deal. Marcus Semien had 3 years left on his deal. And with the way Brandon Nimmo's body was the last couple of seasons with some of the injuries, you could understand why the Mets said, hey, yeah, we'd rather move this money and deal with the higher AAV with Marcus Semien, but with a shorter contract. But Brandon Nimmo swinging the bat really well. You could see a world where the Mets could use a bat like Brandon Nimmo's in their lineup right now. You go get Luis Robert Jr. from the Chicago White Sox. Luis Robert Jr. is fine, right? He's playing okay, like an OPS in the mid 700s, but not setting the world on fire offensively for the New York Mets. One of their biggest moves, if not their biggest move, acquiring Bo Bichette, right? Signing Bo Bichette this offseason to come in and play third base. And Bo Bichette has not swung the bat anywhere near what we expect when we're talking about a guy who has won a batting title, a guy who's led the league in hits multiple times and multiple-time All-Star, went to the World Series with the Toronto Blue Jays last year. A 500 OPS right now for Bo Bichette. Like, you're talking about a guy that looks like a shell of himself. And you always try to give grace to guys who are playing their first season somewhere, right? Especially after being a place for a long time, which Bo Bichette was in Toronto with the Blue Jays. But it just doesn't look great. He's trying to learn a new position, playing third base. It's been touch and go there. There's some days it looks fine. There's some days where a lot of throws are bouncing over there from the hot corner. So that's another move that just hasn't gone right for the New York Mets. Jorge Polanco, who they signed, and they wanted him to play first base and DH. He wasn't swinging the bat well, then landed on the IL. That's another move that you could say, man, not going great. Carson Bench, their top prospect on the position player side, has not been swinging the bat well, even though that might have been the right move to have him join the team on the opening day roster. Hasn't really come around well either. And Francisco Lindor, who we talked about on the show last week, where it just looks like he hasn't been in it mentally, not necessarily swinging the bat great, even though he's started to swing it better in the last couple of days or so. But the mental mistakes there, when you're talking about a team where nothing's going right, you need the guy who is usually the best player on the field to come through, and it just hasn't worked that way. And then you probably are wondering, there's a name you're not mentioning. Juan Soto has been on the IL since basically the start of the season for the Mets with a calf strain. And for a guy who sits in his legs when you're talking about, his stance at the plate, do you want to rush a guy back when the team is playing the way that they've played? And so for the New York Mets, they're just the litany of things going wrong that have led to this long losing streak that has led to, them playing just really bad baseball is the best way to describe it. Carlos Mendoza has gotten a lot of the heat when you're thinking about what the Mets have done so far this season. And I think I've talked to a lot of people around baseball about the Mets and their situation over the last week or so as, this losing streak was adding up. Where after that series against the Cubs, you wonder, do the Mets fire Carlos Mendoza? It wouldn't be his fault. He can't go in the batter's box. He can't, go to the mound and pitch. He can't, play a position defensively. But at some point, front offices usually don't let long losing streaks like this go on too long, especially when David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza changed their coaching staff, right? It's almost a completely new coaching staff this year as it was to last year. And when you make that many changes to a coaching staff, the last person to go is usually the manager. And it's still the middle of April. Managers don't get fired in April, but this seems to be a unique situation. I know he's gotten the vote of confidence from David Stearns, but you just wonder if things continue to go this route, and not even just the losing streak, because by the time this podcast comes out, maybe the Mets have won a game, but maybe they haven't. And how long do you let this go on without addressing anything? Because it's not like you can make any real roster moves that make a difference right now. And this team did make it to the postseason last year, right? The Mets missed the postseason in 2025, and it didn't look good at the end either, right? They got bounced by the Miami Marlins at the end of last season. The same season they gave Juan Soto the largest contract in the history of professional sports. And you're thinking, okay, the Mets are putting a lot of money in to be a team that makes it to the postseason. And not only did they miss last year, they've put themselves in a tremendous hole in 2026. Just 4 teams in the history of Major League Baseball have made it to the postseason with a losing streak of 10 games or more. That's where the Mets find themselves. And that's why you ask yourself, if you're David Stearns, you've put yourself in a position where, regardless of what happens with the losing streak, if they lose 16 of 20 games, right, going into the month of May, they've put themselves in a huge hole the rest of the way. With Atlanta playing the way they're playing, you have to imagine the Philadelphia Phillies figure some things out with the veteran group that they have. And even teams like the Marlins and the Washington Nationals are playing much better baseball than the New York Mets are. So you just wonder where this organization is going, right? It's an older roster, and you do have players on paper. You say, man, should be a talented team. But at what point does owner Steve Cohen say, hey, man, enough is enough? Like, I've invested a lot of money into this team since I bought it in 2020, and we have 2 postseason appearances. We missed the postseason last year when we, brought in Juan Soto. We're likely going to miss the postseason this year with the start we've gotten off to. And for David Stearns, where do you stop the bleeding? I think that's the question for me. Like, where do you turn? Where do you look to make some type of move to address this? And once again, it's not Carlos Mendoza's fault. But I think for the Mets as a franchise, it's soul searching time. Usually you don't have that conversation in April, but when things have gone as bad as they have for the Mets so far this season, you do start to ask yourself if something big needs to happen. And so for the New York Mets, I don't know where they turn. Even if, let's say they did fire Carlos Mendoza, it doesn't change the fact that their roster isn't playing well cohesively. It doesn't change the fact that they are bottom third in Major League Baseball in almost every offensive category so far this season. It doesn't change the fact that their bullpen hasn't pitched well. It doesn't change the fact that their starting rotation is heavily relying on Freddie Peralta, who they acquired from the Milwaukee Brewers, and rookie Nolan McLean, right, to kind of carry them. And it's just really difficult to see them being successful if none of these things changes. Like, of the things that we listed that's been going wrong with those different players, whether it was Marcus Semien, Luis Robert, Bo Bichette, if it was just one of those things and everybody else was playing well, you could probably get through that and you're not in as dire a situation. But when you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different guys not playing up to their career averages, and a bullpen that hasn't pitched well, and a starting rotation that's been shaky, and in-game moves by your manager that have potentially cost you games, that's now when you're talking about the whole. And at some point, something has to happen. But I don't know where the New York Mets go here as we continue in the month of April and head towards the month of May, because that's just 11 games in a row is a lot. And if that gets to 12, 13, 14, what is the point where you just say this has to stop? And if it continues, I gotta believe that it happens sooner rather than later. And I think something a manager told me a long time ago, he said, Russ, I'm going to do this job until they tell me to go home. And that manager had success. And eventually, like happens for many managers, they did tell him to go home. And so for a team that's not winning, it's hard to save people's jobs. It's hard, especially for a team that already missed the postseason, and there was a lot of pressure on them to perform in 2026. So the New York Mets have questions they need to answer, and they have to answer them really fast. But it is getting late early in Queens. Hey guys, thanks for watching this episode of The Relay with Russ Dorsey. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a question for me, be sure to drop it in the comments below, and we'll catch you again here next time.